Today we're talking about Araumi of the Dead Tide, so this takes advantage of creatures in our graveyard and how many opponents we have, so hopefully we have 3 at one time. So why this deck is really sweet is because our commander says we have to tap her with exile cards from our graveyard equal to the number of opponents we have, so we're going to exile 3 cards on top of whatever creature we're going to be targeting from our graveyard. It's going to gain Encore until end of turn, and the Encore cost is equal to its mana cost, so we still have to pay its mana cost. So what all this means is that we're going to exile the creature, pay its mana cost, and for each opponent we're going to create a token that attacks that opponent this turn if able. They gain haste. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Activate only as a sorcery. So let me show you how we can abuse this commander and this deck. So I'm only going to be talking about creatures, so let's talk about the card draw. So Floating Dream Zubra, this is going to be the one where we're going to get the most cards for the least amount of mana. So assuming we have 3 opponents and we have Encore with our commander targeting this creature, we're going to get 3 copies of them. When they're put into the graveyard from play, we draw a card for each Zubra put into the graveyard from play this turn. They all see each other, so we get to draw 9 cards for 2 mana, which is very valuable to us. Really great card. We also have Baleful Strix. Not as much value here, but again, we pay 2 mana, we draw 3 cards, and we can attack our opponents with them because it has Flying and Death Touch and Haste from the Encore from our commander. There's Mole Drifter, a potential of 6 cards from Encore with our commander getting 3 copies of these, and they're 2/2 flyers. We also have Sphinx of Uthun. We're not drawing cards technically off of this, but we're getting Factor Fictions, which are still very valuable. So when this enters the battlefield, we reveal the top 5 cards of our library, and an opponent's going to separate those cards into 2 piles. We're going to put one into our hand and the other into our graveyard. So imagine getting 3 Factor Fictions for 7 mana. That's very valuable to us, and they're also 5/6 flyers. The last one for card draw is Impaler Strike. It's a 3/1 with flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, we may sacrifice it, and if we do, we draw 3 cards. Very powerful stuff right here, and my favorite, of course, has to be that Floating Dream Zubra. It's very powerful. For only 2 mana, we draw 9 cards. Love that one. Moving on to another category I love, let's talk about stealing our opponent's creatures. First up is Sepulchral Primordial. When this enters the battlefield, for each opponent, you may put up to 1 target creature from that player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So now we get 9 creatures in total if we have 3 copies of these. 1 from each opponent just for the first copy, and then add that 2 more times. We're looking at 9 creatures total from our opponent's graveyard if they have it. Very powerful. We also have Diluvian Primordial. It's going to be the same thing except we're targeting instants and sorceries now, and we get to cast those for free. Garuda Doom of Depths. When this enters the battlefield, each player has to mill the top 4, and then we get to put a creature with an even converted mana cost from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. So if we don't hit anything very valuable, it's possible our opponents could have something as well. And what's sweet is that it's 16 cards to look through, so there's a potential that we're going to hit something with this. It's also a 6/6. It's really strong. The last one is Agent of Treachery. This is an expensive card, but when it enters the battlefield, we gain control of target permanent, and at the beginning of the end step, if you control 3 or more permanents you don't own, draw 3 cards, which is very likely whenever we have our commander giving Agent of Treachery Encore. The only problem is we're going to lose Agent of Treachery at our end step, but we do have ways to keep our creatures, which we'll talk about later. The last card in this category I want to talk about is Rakshasa Debaser. So when this attacks, target creature from a defending player's graveyard is going to go onto the battlefield under our control. It also has Encore, which our commander is doing already, but we just have to pay 6. So maybe if we don't have our commander out, I can see us using Encore, because we will have to wait an extra turn because Araumi does not have haste. So again, if you love to take your opponent's creatures, these are going to be the ones I have to recommend. Now as for filling our graveyard, we have a few, and by a few I mean pretty good amount of cards to do so. We have Millikin. We can tap this to mill a card and add a colorless. The next is Eyeblight Colders. When this dies, we're going to create 3 1/1 green elf creature tokens and then mill 3 cards. We also have Mire Triton. Don't be fooled by this. This is actually a pretty powerful card. For 2 mana, when it enters the battlefield, we're going to mill 2 and then gain 2 life. It's also a 2/1 with Death Touch. Next is Stitcher's Supplier. When this enters the battlefield or dies, put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard. So we're going to mill 3. This is definitely the one I would recommend you go for because it also costs 1 mana and you get 3 cards when it enters and when it dies. Champion of Wits. When it enters the battlefield, you may draw a card equal to its power. If you do, discard 2 cards. So this could be a great way to start filling our graveyard. If we have Encore on this from Araumi, it will enter the battlefield. Let's say we get 3 copies. That's drawing us 6 cards. We still have to discard 6 cards. So maybe if we have a creature in our hand that we'd rather have in our graveyard, this can be an option for that. Next is Undead Butler. I really like this one. For 2, when it enters the battlefield, we mill 3, but when it dies, dies, you may exile it, which we're going to do already, but when you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Very powerful stuff here. Second to last, we have Deranged Assistant. We're going to mill a card if we tap it and get one colorless. The last one is Crow of Dark Tidings. Love this one again, but it does cost 3 mana. We get a 2/1 flyer. When it enters the battlefield or dies, we're going to put the top 2 cards of our library into our graveyard. So that's what we have creature-wise for milling and filling up our graveyard. Now remember I said we could potentially keep our creatures. Well, Sundial of the Infinite is going to be the way to do that. We can pay 1, tap it to end the turn, but we can only activate this during our turn. What's great about this is that Araumi has us sacrifice our creatures at our end step. So if we use this before the end step, we get to keep those copies that we made. Same with Teferi's Veil. Whenever any creature you control attacks, it phases out at the end of combat. So when creatures are phased out, they no longer exist. They can't be targeted, they can't block, they can't do anything. And so we get to keep our creatures with Araumi. Now, again, these are not creatures, so I did add these to this category. It's Altar of Dementia. This is also filling up our graveyard, but now we have a sack outlet. If we have no use for those creatures that we're making copies of with our commander, we can then sacrifice them, fill up our graveyard, and get even more potential goodies from our deck. Next is, as for protection, we have Swiftfoot Boots, and we also have Lightning Greaves. So what's great about these is that these are going to help us protect Araumi or give her haste, which is very powerful because the turn we cast her, we will most likely not be able to activate her ability, but with these, we will be able to. So it's really sweet. Now, I'm usually not one for tutors, but in this deck, it's very valuable. So I have Vile Entomber. When this enters the battlefield, search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. It's a 2/2 with Death Touch. Typically, if I really need a tutor, this is going to really help out the deck, and that means if we're looking for tutors or we're playing these cards, the deck is really struggling, which is going to happen. So these help the deck get back onto what pace it should be. We also have Arik Lore Mage. This is a card that nobody cares about, but it's very valuable. It's the same thing as Vile Entomber, except now it has a tap ability, and we can repeat this over and over. The last one is Gravebreaker Lamia. When it enters the battlefield, we search for a card, put it into our graveyard, and then shuffle our library. Spells we cast from our graveyard are going to cost 1 less. That doesn't matter to us, but it is a 4/4 with lifelink, which is pretty sweet. 2 cards that didn't really fit anywhere. Let's talk about Solemn Simulacrum. This is going to help us ramp, and also when it dies, it's going to give us card draw. So if we get 3 copies of these, we get 3 basics, and we get 3 cards. Next is Archaeomancer. If we really need an instant or sorcery from our deck, this is going to be the way to do it. Otherwise, we don't really have any more options. So moving on to the removal, there is a lot. So starting out with Demon's Disciple. For 2 and 1 black, when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Now, if we put out 3 of these, we can sack them to themselves, but our opponents still have to sack 3 creatures or a planeswalker. There's also Ravenous Chupacabra. If we'd rather target something, this will be the way to do it, and it's only something our opponent controls. Next is Kyrie the Swirling Sky. It's a 6/6 with flying and ward 3, so it's really, really strong already, but when it dies, which our creatures are going to do often, especially when we have 3 copies of these and we have to sack them anyways, we get to choose one. Return any number of target non-land permanents with total mana value 6 or less to their owner's hands, or we can mill 6 and return up to 2 instants and or sorceries from our graveyard to our hand. Okay, so I was wrong about that. I forget about the second ability, but typically I am messing with my opponents with the first choice. And what's crazy is that since it says total mana value 6 or less, this is meaning we can get rid of tokens because they have a 0 mana value. This is a really strong card. Next is Plague Crafter. When it enters the battlefield, each player has to sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, and if they can't, they have to discard a card. So if they have no creatures, they're still going to have to do something about it. Next is Overseer of the Damned. When it enters the battlefield, we can destroy target creature, or whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. Next is Meteor Golem. When it enters the battlefield, we can destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. So now we can mess with enchantments, artifacts, whatever's really putting us back. My favorite removal in this deck is Massacre Worm. This card also means a lot to me. I won it in a draft, and it was an all-rare draft, believe it or not. But what's sweet about this is that when we have 3 copies of this, its effects are going to triple. So when this enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control typically get -2/-2 until end of turn, but when we have 3 copies, their creatures are actually getting -6/-6 until end of turn. It also says whenever a creature an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, that player loses 2 life. That now becomes 6 life whenever their creatures die. This is a really powerful card. Also along the lines of taking our opponent's card, I did put this in removal because even if we can't cast the artifact we're getting from Thada Adel, we're still able to remove that artifact from their deck, and that can be very powerful. Next is Fleshbag Marauder. So when this enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. And last is Shriekmaw. So we could could cast it for its evoke cost, but it has Fear, it's a 3/2, and when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. So that is what we have for the removal. The last two cards I want to talk about is pretty much our bombs. How we're going to win this game if we can't do it with everything else that I just showed you. The first one is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. So for example, let's say we have I guess we'll have 5. We have 5 black mana, and this is in our graveyard. So right now we have 3 black mana. We tap Araumi, exile 3 cards because we have 3 opponents. We now have 3 copies of Grey Merchant of Asphodel. When these enter the battlefield, they all see each other, and the copies of Grey Merchant of Asphodel, they also have Devotion. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Devotion from just our Grey Merchant of Asphodels, on top of the 3 we have up here. So that's 9 total. So 9 times 3, because we have 3 Merchant of Asphodels, is 27. So we will deal each opponent 27 damage, and we gain whatever 27 times 3 is, which is 81, I believe, which is really sweet. So you can see how powerful that is. Now let's talk about Abhorrent Overlord. This is the other option we have. Again, we tap Araumi, we get 3 copies of Abhorrent Overlord. When this enters the battlefield, we get 1/1 black harpy creature tokens with flying equal to our devotion to black. And it's going to be the same thing. We have 6 devotion from our Abhorrent Overlords, and 3 from these cards. 9 times 3 is 27. So we're going to get 27 1/1 black harpy creature tokens with flying. This is a very silly and powerful deck when it comes to those finishers. So let me know what you think of Araumi of the Dead Tide. It's a very powerful, and it can be very budget friendly of a deck. Thank you to the members who help support this show. You can also become a member for only 99 cents each month by hitting that join button down below. And I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.